New York City. A city of impossible ambition and relentless reinvention. A skyline built from dreams, disasters, fortunes, and fearless ideas. Lenape hunters first knew this island. Dutch merchants claimed it. The British reshaped it. Immigrants from every corner of the world remade it again and again. And through it all, New Yorkers, restless, resilient, impatient, impossible to intimidate, kept pushing the city forward. Few places on earth have changed the course of history as often as New York. It has been a frontier trading post, the gateway to a continent, the financial capital of the modern world, the birthplace of countless cultural revolutions, and a city that somehow grows stronger every time it is tested. In this video, we're going to journey through the entire history of New York City. From the forests and tidal marshes that covered Manhattan long before Europeans arrived, through Dutch colonists, British rule, revolution, immigration, skyscrapers, gangsters, financial booms, blackouts, terrorist attacks, and into the city that stands today. Along the way, we're going to do something a little different. Using advanced AI techniques, we've transformed original paintings, maps, engravings, and historical photographs into vivid, lifelike scenes. Instead of simply imagining the streets of New Amsterdam or watching Broadway emerge from muddy colonial roads, you'll experience them as close to reality as we've ever been able to recreate. Because New York isn't simply a city. It's an experiment that never stopped. A place where millions arrived with nothing, convinced everything was possible. A city that has survived wars, riots, economic collapse, epidemics, fires, terrorism, hurricanes, and financial crashes, only to reinvent itself every single time. From an island of forests beside the Hudson River to one of the most influential cities on Earth. This is the entire history of New York City. Let's begin at the beginning. Long before New York became a city, before there were avenues, skyscrapers, bridges, or even roads, there was simply water, forest, and rock. Around the end of the last ice age, roughly 12,000 years ago, retreating glaciers carved the valleys that would become the Hudson River and New York Harbor. Sea levels slowly rose, flooding the lower valley and creating one of the finest natural harbors on Earth. Dense forests covered Manhattan. White-tailed deer wandered beneath towering oak, chestnut, and hickory trees. Black bears, wolves, beavers, and countless birds thrived in an ecosystem almost unimaginably rich. Thousands of years later, the first people to truly call this place home were the Lenape. Rather than building large cities or stone monuments, the Lenape lived in villages scattered across present-day Manhattan, Staten Island, Long Island, and the surrounding mainland. They hunted deer, caught oysters from immense shell beds, fished the rivers for sturgeon and striped bass, and cultivated corn, beans, and squash, the three sisters that formed the backbone of their agriculture. To them, Manhattan was not Manhattan. It was Mannahatta, usually translated as the island of many hills. And that description was remarkably accurate. The flat landscape we know today did not yet exist. Rocky ridges, streams, freshwater ponds, marshes, and steep wooded hills stretched across the island from north to south. For thousands of years, the Lenape traded peacefully with neighboring peoples using a network of rivers that functioned as the highways of northeastern North America. Canoes moved far more efficiently than walking through dense forests, and the sheltered harbor at Mannahatta naturally became an important meeting place for commerce. Then, in the early 16th century, unfamiliar ships began appearing on the horizon. European fishermen had already explored parts of the Atlantic coast, but in 1524 the Italian navigator Giovanni da Verrazzano, sailing for France, entered New York Harbor. He admired its sheltered waters but stayed only briefly before continuing his voyage. Nearly a century later, another explorer would change the destiny of the island forever. In 1609, the English navigator Henry Hudson, employed by the Dutch East India Company, sailed aboard the Half Moon into the magnificent harbor before navigating the great river that now bears his name. Hudson hoped he had found a passage to Asia. Instead, he discovered something equally valuable, a region overflowing with beaver pelts, the most profitable commodity in Europe at the time. The Dutch moved quickly. In 1624 they established the colony of New Netherland, and soon afterward founded a small trading settlement on the southern tip of Mannahatta. They called it New Amsterdam. It began with little more than wooden houses, warehouses, a crude fort overlooking the harbor, and muddy tracks connecting scattered buildings. Few could have imagined that this tiny fur trading outpost, perched on the edge of a vast wilderness, would one day become the economic and cultural capital of the modern world. But that transformation had only just begun. New Amsterdam was never supposed to become one of the world's great cities. In fact, during its first few decades, there were plenty of reasons to think it might disappear altogether. Life on the edge of the Dutch Empire was difficult. The settlement was isolated, heavily dependent on supply ships crossing the Atlantic, and surrounded by a wilderness that Europeans barely understood. Winters were harsh. Food shortages were common. Disease spread easily through the cramped wooden buildings clustered around Fort Amsterdam. Even attracting settlers proved to be a struggle. The Dutch Republic was one of the wealthiest places in Europe. Most people had little reason to abandon prosperous cities like Amsterdam or Rotterdam for an uncertain future thousands of miles away. As a result, New Amsterdam remained surprisingly small. By the 1640s, only a few hundred permanent residents lived on the southern tip of Manhattan. Yet the colony possessed something extraordinary. Its harbor. Every ship sailing into New Netherland naturally arrived here first. Merchant vessels unloaded European manufactured goods before returning home packed with valuable beaver pelts, timber, and agricultural products from the interior. Gradually, warehouses multiplied along the waterfront. Taverns appeared beside the docks. Blacksmiths, carpenters, coopers, brewers, and merchants followed the growing trade. The settlement became one of the most remarkably diverse places in North America. Dutch settlers lived alongside Germans, Scandinavians, English traders, French Protestants, Sephardic Jews fleeing persecution, free Africans, and Native American communities that continued to trade with the newcomers. Contemporary records suggest that by the middle of the 17th century, more than a dozen languages could already be heard in its narrow streets. That diversity, one of New York's defining characteristics today, was present almost from the very beginning. But survival remained uncertain. Relations between Dutch settlers and the Lenape steadily deteriorated as European expansion pushed farther into indigenous lands. Misunderstandings over land ownership, competition for resources, and increasingly aggressive colonial policies erupted into violence. Everything reached a breaking point during Kieft's War in the 1640s. Governor Willem Kieft ordered attacks on Lenape communities that resulted in devastating massacres. Instead of intimidating his opponents, the assaults united many indigenous groups against the colony. Farms were abandoned. Outlying settlements were burned. Trade nearly collapsed, and New Amsterdam itself feared complete destruction. The colony survived, but only just. The conflict permanently weakened Dutch authority and exposed how vulnerable New Amsterdam truly was. Yet once peace slowly returned, merchants reopened their businesses, new settlers arrived, and construction resumed almost immediately. It would become a recurring pattern throughout the city's history. Crisis. Recovery. Growth. Each catastrophe seemed to make New Amsterdam not weaker, but more determined to continue. The little Dutch trading post had survived its first great test. A far greater one was already approaching across the Atlantic. By the 1660s, New Amsterdam had become the commercial heart of New Netherland. Its harbor was crowded with merchant ships. Windmills overlooked the settlement. Wooden homes climbed north from Fort Amsterdam, while a defensive wall stretched across the island where Wall Street stands today. It looked secure. It wasn't. In 1664, an English fleet sailed into New York Harbor. There was no great battle. No heroic last stand. The English simply arrived with overwhelming force and demanded the colony surrender. Governor Peter Stuyvesant wanted to fight. The citizens did not. Most of the merchants cared less about which European king ruled them than whether trade continued uninterrupted. Facing impossible odds, Stuyvesant reluctantly surrendered without firing a major shot. Just like that, New Amsterdam disappeared. The English renamed it New York, honoring James, Duke of York, the brother of King Charles II. One empire had replaced another almost overnight. Yet for ordinary residents, daily life changed surprisingly little. Dutch churches remained open. Dutch merchants continued doing business. Dutch families stayed in their homes. The language, customs, and architecture of New Amsterdam lingered for generations, quietly shaping the city's identity beneath its New English name. But political stability proved fragile. In 1673, during another Anglo-Dutch war, the Dutch briefly recaptured the colony, renaming it New Orange. Less than a year later, diplomacy in Europe handed it back to England under the Treaty of Westminster. 3 different governments had ruled the city in barely a decade. The uncertainty was exhausting. Then came another crisis. As New York entered the 18th century, disease became the city's constant companion. Yellow fever arrived aboard trading ships from the Caribbean. Smallpox spread repeatedly through the growing population. Outbreak after outbreak swept through streets that were overcrowded, poorly drained, and filled with open wells contaminated by waste. Doctors understood almost nothing about how these diseases spread. Entire neighborhoods emptied as wealthier residents fled into the countryside whenever epidemics appeared. The dead accumulated faster than the living could bury them. Yet commerce never truly stopped. Ships kept arriving. Markets kept opening. Immigrants kept coming. Each epidemic faded, only for the city to emerge larger than before. Then politics added another layer of fear. As tensions between Britain and its American colonies steadily increased during the 1760s and early 1770s, New York found itself deeply divided. Loyalists supported the crown. Patriots demanded greater liberty. Families, merchants, neighbors, even churches found themselves on opposite sides. The city that had survived conquest, changing empires, and relentless disease was now drifting towards something even more dangerous. Civil War. And before long, New York would become one of the most fiercely contested cities in the American Revolution. By 1776, New York had become the prize neither side could afford to lose. Whoever controlled its magnificent harbor controlled the gateway to the American colonies. Its rivers connected New England to the south. Its ports supplied armies. Its merchants financed trade. If Britain held New York, the rebellion might be strangled before it truly began. The British knew it. So did the Americans. Standing between them was an unlikely commander. George Washington was 44 years old, a Virginia planter with limited experience commanding large armies. He had never led a force anywhere near the size of the one now under his command. Many of his soldiers were poorly trained militia. They lacked uniforms, ammunition, and discipline. Against them stood the most powerful military on earth. In the summer of 1776, more than 30,000 British and Hessian troops assembled around New York, the largest expeditionary force Britain had ever sent across the Atlantic. The odds were overwhelming. The Battle of Long Island quickly turned into disaster. British forces outflanked Washington's army, inflicting heavy casualties and trapping thousands of American soldiers against the East River. The revolution itself seemed only days away from ending. Then Washington made the decision that saved it. Rather than sacrificing his entire army in one hopeless battle, he chose survival over glory. Under the cover of darkness on August 29, 1776, every available boat, from fishing vessels to ferries, quietly crossed the East River. Thick fog settled over the water before dawn, concealing the evacuation from British lookouts. By sunrise, nearly 9,000 Continental soldiers had escaped without the British realizing they were gone. It remains one of the greatest military withdrawals in American history. New York fell. The British occupied the city for the next 7 years, making it their military headquarters throughout most of the Revolutionary War. For many patriots, it looked like the revolution had failed. Yet Washington understood something his opponents did not. Wars are not always won by holding cities. Sometimes they're won by keeping an army alive. While the British controlled New York, Washington rebuilt his forces, struck when opportunities appeared, and slowly exhausted an empire fighting thousands of miles from home. When the British surrendered at Yorktown in 1781, their grip on North America collapsed. 2 years later, in November 1783, British troops finally evacuated New York. Washington entered the city not as a defeated general fleeing through the night, but as the victorious commander of a new nation. It was one of history's great reversals. The city that had witnessed America's darkest military defeat had become the stage for one of its greatest triumphs. And for New York, the revolution was only the beginning. Its greatest age still lay ahead. If the American Revolution gave New York a nation, the 19th century transformed it into a global city. The opening of the Erie Canal in 1825 connected New York Harbor directly to the vast interior of North America. Suddenly, grain from the Midwest, timber from the Great Lakes, and manufactured goods from Europe all flowed through one port. Trade exploded. Banks multiplied. Factories rose. Millions of immigrants poured into the city from Ireland, Germany, and beyond. By the 1860s, New York was the economic engine of the United States. But prosperity concealed deep fractures. The nation was tearing itself apart. When the American Civil War began in 1861, New York's merchants were divided. Many supported the Union. Others depended heavily on trade with the slaveholding South. As the war dragged on, casualties mounted, prices soared, and resentment spread through the city's overcrowded immigrant neighborhoods. Then came the draft. In 1863, the federal government introduced compulsory military service. Wealthier men could avoid serving by paying $300 for a substitute, a fortune beyond the reach of ordinary laborers. To many working-class New Yorkers, the law seemed to declare that the rich could buy their way out of war while the poor were expected to die. On July 13, 1863, the city exploded. What began as protests against the draft quickly descended into one of the bloodiest urban uprisings in American history. Crowds stormed government buildings. Streetcars were overturned. Police officers were beaten. Homes were looted and burned. But the violence soon took an even darker turn. Fueled by racism and fear that freed enslaved people would compete for jobs, mobs targeted black New Yorkers across the city. Innocent men were lynched in the streets. Families fled for their lives. Businesses were destroyed. The Colored Orphan Asylum, home to more than 200 vulnerable children, was set ablaze by rioters. Miraculously, staff members managed to evacuate nearly every child before the building collapsed into flames. For 4 terrifying days, parts of New York resembled a war zone. The army, fresh from the Battle of Gettysburg, was rushed into the city. Federal troops marched through Manhattan, exchanging gunfire with rioters before finally restoring order. By the time the violence ended, at least 120 people had been killed, though many historians believe the true number was considerably higher. The Draft Riots exposed a painful truth. Beneath New York's wealth and astonishing growth lay profound divisions of race, class, and inequality that could erupt with terrifying speed. Yet even this catastrophe failed to halt the city's rise. Factories reopened. Immigrants kept arriving. Construction resumed. The streets were rebuilt. New York had stared into one of the darkest chapters of its history, and somehow continued growing. Its most dramatic transformation, however, was still to come. Every great city eventually produces someone who changes its physical shape forever. For New York, that man was Robert Moses. He was never elected mayor. He was never governor. He was never president. Yet during the middle decades of the 20th century, few people wielded more power over New York than he did. Moses understood something simple. If you control the roads, the bridges, the parks, and the public authorities that build them, you control the future of the city itself. Beginning in the 1920s and accelerating through the Great Depression and after the Second World War, Robert Moses launched one of the largest urban construction programs in modern history. He built parkways that connected the city to Long Island. He oversaw the construction of major bridges, including the Triborough Bridge, now the Robert F. Kennedy Bridge. He expanded beaches at Jones Beach and Orchard Beach. Parks, playgrounds, swimming pools, tunnels, expressways, and public housing projects appeared across New York at an astonishing pace. To many New Yorkers, he was a visionary. He dragged the city into the age of the automobile and modern infrastructure. Millions benefited from the roads he built. Millions enjoyed the parks he created. His fingerprints are everywhere. But like every transformative figure in history, Robert Moses carried a contradiction. To build his New York, entire neighborhoods had to disappear. Working-class communities were demolished to make room for expressways. Tens of thousands of residents were forced from their homes through eminent domain. Vibrant streets that had grown organically over generations were carved apart by highways designed for speeding traffic rather than neighborhood life. The Cross Bronx Expressway became the clearest example. Completed during the 1950s, it sliced directly through established communities, displacing thousands of families and contributing to decades of economic decline in parts of the Bronx. Critics argued that Moses valued automobiles more than people, efficiency more than community. His greatest creations came with enormous human costs. By the 1960s, resistance finally emerged. Writers, neighborhood activists, and ordinary residents began challenging Moses' vision for the city. Among them was Jane Jacobs, whose passionate defense of traditional neighborhoods helped stop several proposed expressways through Lower Manhattan, including plans that would have erased large sections of Greenwich Village and Soho. For the first time in decades, Robert Moses lost. The city had begun questioning whether progress always required destruction. Yet his legacy remains impossible to escape. Drive across New York. Walk through one of its great parks. Cross one of its bridges. Follow one of its expressways. Sooner or later, you're moving through Robert Moses' New York. He built the modern metropolis. He also destroyed parts of the old one forever. And as the city entered the second half of the 20th century, New York would discover that concrete and steel alone could not protect it from the challenges that lay ahead. Long before skyscrapers defined New York, someone had already decided what the city would become. In 1811, 3 commissioners unveiled one of the boldest urban planning proposals in history. Instead of allowing Manhattan to grow naturally, street by winding street as most ancient cities had done, they proposed something radically different. A giant grid. 12 broad avenues. 155 cross streets. Thousands of perfectly measured rectangular blocks stretching north across the island. It looked almost unnatural. Because it was. The commissioners' plan ignored hills, streams, valleys, ponds, and even existing farms. Engineers blasted through solid rock, filled marshes, and leveled uneven ground until the island itself began conforming to the blueprint. Nature would adapt to the city. Not the other way around. Supporters called it visionary. The grid made land easier to divide, easier to sell, and easier to develop. Property values soared. Construction accelerated. Investors could purchase identical blocks with mathematical precision, fueling one of the greatest real estate booms in history. The city became astonishingly efficient. But efficiency wasn't the only goal. A predictable street system also made New York easier to govern. Wide avenues allowed goods, soldiers, police, and eventually automobiles to move rapidly across Manhattan. Clear sightlines reduced the maze-like complexity of older European cities, where narrow medieval streets had often favored barricades and popular uprisings. Order was literally built into the landscape. The city became easier to patrol. Easier to navigate. Easier to expand. Yet the cost was enormous. Ancient hills disappeared beneath dynamite. Freshwater streams vanished underground. Collect Pond, the city's largest natural lake, was filled in entirely, despite engineers warning that the unstable ground would create future problems. They were right. Buildings settled unevenly, streets flooded, and the neighborhood that emerged became one of the poorest and most notorious districts in 19th-century America. 5 points. Meanwhile, countless farms, estates, and natural habitats vanished beneath an advancing sea of brick and stone. The Manhattan we know today is, in many ways, an engineered landscape. Almost every block represents a deliberate decision. Even the exceptions reveal the struggle between nature and design. Broadway refused to obey the grid because it followed an ancient Lenape trading path that existed centuries before the commissioners drew their ruler across the map. The resulting intersections, Times Square, Madison Square, Union Square, became some of the most recognizable places on Earth precisely because they broke the pattern. Today, visitors praise Manhattan's remarkable simplicity. Getting lost is surprisingly difficult. Finding an address is almost effortless. What feels intuitive was carefully designed more than 2 centuries ago. The commissioner's plan did far more than organize streets. It reshaped an island. It accelerated commerce. It concentrated power. And it created the physical framework upon which the modern New York skyline would rise, one perfectly measured block at a time. Unlike London, Warsaw, or Paris, New York never fell under enemy occupation during the Second World War. But that did not mean the war spared the city. By 1941, New York had become the industrial and financial heart of the Allied war effort. Its shipyards worked around the clock. Factories that had once produced automobiles now built tanks, aircraft engines, ammunition, and military equipment. The Brooklyn Navy Yard became one of the busiest shipbuilding facilities in the world, launching battleships and repairing damaged vessels destined for both the Atlantic and Pacific. Millions of soldiers passed through New York Harbor on their way to Europe. For countless Americans, the Statue of Liberty was the final image of home before entering war. The city itself became a target. German U-boats prowled the Atlantic coast, sinking merchant ships within sight of American shores. Air raid drills became routine. Windows were blacked out at night. Anti-aircraft batteries were positioned around the harbor. For the first time, many New Yorkers realized that oceans no longer guaranteed safety. When victory finally arrived in 1945, New York emerged richer, larger, and more influential than ever before. Wall Street became the financial capital of the Western world. The newly created United Nations chose Manhattan for its permanent headquarters, making New York not only America's greatest city, but one of the world's diplomatic capitals. It seemed unstoppable. Then came another reversal. During the 1970s, factories closed. Middle-class families moved to the suburbs. Crime surged. The subway became covered in graffiti. Entire neighborhoods struggled with poverty and abandoned buildings. In 1975, New York came frighteningly close to bankruptcy. The city that symbolized American success suddenly looked like a cautionary tale. Many believed its best days were over. They were wrong. During the 1980s and 1990s, investment returned. Crime fell dramatically. Times Square transformed from one of America's most notorious districts into one of its busiest tourist destinations. New industries emerged in finance, media, fashion, and technology. Then, on the morning of September 11, 2001, New York faced the greatest attack in its history. 2 hijacked airliners struck the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center. Nearly 3,000 people lost their lives. For a few terrible hours, the skyline itself seemed to collapse along with the city's confidence. Yet once again, New York refused to remain broken. The debris was cleared. The financial district reopened. A new skyline rose above Lower Manhattan, crowned by One World Trade Center, a symbol not of forgetting, but of rebuilding. That pattern had now repeated itself for centuries. War. Economic collapse. Crime. Terrorism. Each time, predictions of New York's decline seemed convincing. Each time, the city reinvented itself instead. Perhaps that has always been New York's greatest talent. Not avoiding catastrophe, but refusing to let catastrophe have the final word. Today, more than 8 million people call New York City home. Over 300 languages are spoken across its 5 boroughs, making it the most linguistically diverse city on Earth. It remains one of the world's great financial capitals. One of its great cultural capitals. One of its great immigrant capitals. But numbers alone don't explain New York. Because this city has never been defined by its buildings. It's defined by what happens after those buildings fall. For thousands of years, this island has reinvented itself. The forests of Mannahatta became a Lenape trading ground. The Lenape homeland became New Amsterdam. New Amsterdam became New York. The colonial port became the capital of a new nation. The harbor welcomed millions of immigrants who transformed America forever. The skyline climbed higher than anyone thought possible. Every generation built something the previous generation believed impossible. And every generation also faced a catastrophe. Wars. Occupation. Epidemics. The Great Fire of 1835. The Draft Riots. Economic depression. The financial crisis of the 1970s. Crime waves. September 11th. Hurricane Sandy. The COVID-19 pandemic. Again and again, people predicted New York's decline. Again and again, they were wrong. Each crisis left scars. But each crisis also produced another reinvention. That's what makes New York. New York. Not perfection. Not wealth. Not even power. Relentless reinvention. It's loud. It's crowded. It's expensive. It's impatient. It's unequal. It's overwhelming. And somehow, all of those contradictions exist alongside extraordinary creativity, resilience, and optimism. Millions of people continue arriving here with the same belief that brought Dutch merchants, Irish laborers, Jewish refugees, Italian families, Caribbean communities, Latin American entrepreneurs, Asian immigrants, artists, dreamers, and innovators before them. That tomorrow can be better than today. Perhaps that's the real history of New York City. Not the history of governments. Not the history of skyscrapers. Not even the history of America itself. It's the history of ordinary people arriving from somewhere else, and together building one of the most influential cities the world has ever known. If you've watched all the way to the end, thank you. History isn't just about remembering dates or famous names. It's about understanding why places become what they are, and why they continue to matter. And nowhere tells that story quite like New York. From the forests of Mannahatta to the skyline of Manhattan. The city has never stopped becoming. And perhaps, it never will.